I've got a very cloudy eye in that picture, as you can see. Dr. Vinod, what are my options?
So first, to understand what's got you here. So previously, when you could see perfectly and you never had a vision problem, your natural lens was able to change shape to accommodate, basically to go fatter and thinner, to be able to focus an image that's up close or further away. And what happens over time, it's the collagen in the lens starts to stiffen. And as it stiffens, it starts to lose the ability to change shape. And this is where you remember you started to sort of push things a little further away, and then eventually you reach the point where the arm's just not long enough. You think whether I either extend my arm or get my glasses. You consider strongly extending your arm as an option, but you're eventually stuck with the glasses. And the problem is that basically it's a progressive situation, as you've experienced, right? Sort of every few months it's just fractionally worse and fractionally worse.
I'm on +2s now. Yeah.
Exactly, and 2.5 is almost the limit, So it sort of tells you that it's not getting better on its own, So as it starts to then get stiffer, it eventually also starts to go a bit hazy. So it goes from sort of transparent to more sort of translucent. And as that starts to happen, eventually the distance also starts to decline. All right, that's the kind of natural progression of the problem. So when you look at it on here, you sort of see that when we're shining the light through your lens, okay, that's my light, that's the front of your lens, that's the light going through the lens, and that's the back, all right? And you can see how there's this kind of translucent appearance, of the lens. And if I show you what a clear lens looks like, so you have a bit of a reference here, you'll see, so look, that's hazy.
Yes.
And that here is clear, right?
Oh,
so
wow.
you can see the difference between sort of transparent and translucent, right? So you sort of start off your life, somewhere there, and it's sort of a bit like throughout your life, your lens kind of gets cooked a little bit. It's like cooking an egg white, that over time with ultraviolet, the analogy of an egg, its heat, starts to basically denature the protein in the lens, which then starts to make it from transparent to sort of translucent. And just like when you're cooking an egg, once it starts to go down that path, you can't turn it backwards.
Right.
Because once that protein is denatured, you can't renature it, it's done, and then it just continues to gradually progress and progress and progress. So if you use a camera as an analogy, since you are also into images and photography, what you'll notice is that it's sort of like the lens of your camera that starts to go frosty. And your kind of autofocus that you did have goes on to manual focus, where you're having to use your hands now to get you to see with external lenses.
Right.
So when you look sort of broadly speaking at what I suppose one of the treatment options involves, is basically trying to wipe that lens of the camera clear so it's transparent again, so allows light into the eye unrestricted, and at the same time trying to put you back from manual focus onto autofocus. All right, so that's the overall sort of broad principle of what you're trying to do. Now this particular option that we're talking about is more sort of a long-term option. This is kind of essentially a lifelong option, because once that focusing mechanism has been addressed, it doesn't then decay or degrade, because the way it's addressed is using a system that doesn't require physical movement. It just uses light to allow you to focus. So hence, whether it's 10 years, 20 years, 30 years down the line, the focusing ability of that lens doesn't decay. So there are other options, such as laser-based options, which is sort of where you do something called monovision or blended vision, where one eye is left fully for distance and the other eye is a bit more for near. It's an option. It's not always, the thing is, it's not a long-term option.
Right.
It may solve the problem for a few years, but eventually, once the lens is already kicked off, we know that it's going to need treatment, and so the question is that when is the right time? That's sort of the golden question, really, and it's heavily down to a few different factors. One is, how much is it impacting you in your daily life? What is the real impact? If someone loves their glasses and they're happy to sort of carry on, and that's fine, they can continue doing that. But if it's significantly impacting your quality of life, and the fact that there is clear evidence of hazy change in the lens that we know is only going to get worse, then considering treatment becomes a feasible option.
Right.
Like with anything, you've got to balance the pros and the cons, the risks versus the benefits, and you've got to make a balanced decision, sort of what makes sense to you. So with this kind of the multifocal option, what we're discussing with yourself, basically, there are, like with everything, there are benefits, there are some negatives, and we've got to balance, whether the positives outweigh the negatives. So in terms of the positives, the fact that, as we said, once treated, that focusing mechanism stays in place. So it is a long-term solution. So that's one of the huge positives, because when we see our patients we've treated sort of 12, 15 years ago, they still are completely glasses free, and they're obviously just as happy as they were when they first had it done. So that's huge, you know, because that's not common generally in any sort of medical procedure, let alone prosthetic procedure.
Yes.
And then at the same time, the fact is that you are preventing any future cataract development, because you're essentially treating the lens at this stage. So you're essentially treating, if you like, early cataract at this stage, you know. So once the hazy lens is cleared, it doesn't go hazy again as such, you know. So that lens is in place, everything's clear, and typically it stays that way. Of course, the rest of the eye can go through other changes, but the fact is the focusing mechanism usually stays pretty much well established then. The process itself takes about 5 to 10 minutes. It's all done with eye drop anesthesia. There's no injections or stitches, so it's not particularly a difficult experience by any means. In terms of potential negatives, things like ones that we know for sure everyone experiences are that because the lens focuses light by using rings within the structure of the lens, sort of like we were showing you there. You know, so that's the kind of the multifocality. So if you compare that to what we call a monofocal lens or a fixed focus lens, you see how that doesn't have any rings. So it's actually the rings that give you the focusing ability. It sort of diffracts the light, bends the light to give you a near focus, an intermediate focus, and a distance focus. And it distributes light to allow you to do that. So hence afterwards, for example, similar to now, if you wanted to read something fine print or something small, you'd want a decent light, because the more input you get of light, the more output you get in terms of vision, because it's light based. The same thing applies to, because of the rings within the lens, particularly initially when you're sort of out in the evening when your pupil dilates basically, because when your pupil dilates a lot of stray light comes in, and that actually when you look at a bright light source you see some rings around the light, all right? And those rings initially, because they're new, they can annoy you a little bit, you know, because you've never seen them as such before. But they're not blurry, they're actually clean, sharp, and quite crisp. So the way to kind of neuro-adapt or get around that is you sort of don't focus on the rings, and over the few weeks and months they sort of disappear out of your vision. Sort of like when people have floaters, you know, when they look for them, they will see these little things moving around, but when they don't look for them, they're gone. And it's sort of that sort of thing, and different people have different abilities of neuroadaptation, you know. So we kind of, part of the consultation is also gauging your ability to neuroadapt. How good are you generally with change, you know? And if we feel that you're generally not someone very good with change, we may not recommend that treatment, because, you know, you may find it harder to get used to the new vision that you have, you know. Other things sort of procedure related wise, such as infection and so on, they're less than 1 in 10,000 statistically, as per our audited results. So they're not sort of frequent issues. If you can summarize it, we would say probably 1 to 2 in 100 would have some issue, but the majority, including infection, are manageable and treatable as long as they're identified and you keep your follow-ups and your regimes. And to be honest, Touchwood, when we've looked at our own data, you know, we found that if you stick to the follow-up and you stick to the treatment and the schedule and all that sort of stuff, we don't tend to see many of these issues, you know, in terms of infections or other issues. Another point also, when you're looking at timing, you know, when one should consider this treatment, there is an important point to realize that the treatment is done by dissolving the cloudy content of the lens. So it uses ultrasound, essentially a cold energy, to break up the cloudy content. So the more thick the lens is, or the more opacified or solidified it is, the more energy needed to clear it. And of course, the more energy you introduce into the eye, the more chance of an impact, you know. So there is some sort of practical advantage as well of not sort of leaving it till the nth hour to treating it, apart from the fact that obviously you get a lifestyle benefit and improvement in quality of vision and life. But on the other hand, it has to be balanced with, you know, how much real impact is that going to make to your life? If it's a marginal improvement, then why undergo a procedure? You know, you can wear the glasses and you can wait till you feel that it's impacting your life sufficiently. So it's definitely not for everyone. It's really for selected individuals who really fit, firstly, the quite stringent criteria, as you've seen. That whole sort of in-depth assessment
Yes.
is really to identify largely whether it is something that we should even discuss or even should raise as an option with you. So overall, there is a solution. There are other solutions, but the other solutions typically are not long-term. They're generally short to medium-term. So as a long-term solution, this is the only long-term solution that I can recommend.
Well, I'm very happy with that. What about lens replacement? That's different.
Actually, it's not different. This, in a sense, it is lens replacement, but I don't like the word replacement because you're not actually taking the whole lens out. You're just taking out the cloudy content, the stuff that's not working basically at the moment.
So this is what some people would call lens replacement?
They would call it lens replacement, yes.
Because that sounds scary.
Exactly, but I think it's the misnomer, I think, which makes it sound scary, because it sounds like you're taking something entirely out and putting something entirely.
Yeah, and then that's the end.
Yeah, it's not really like that. It's actually, the capsule of the lens stays the same as it always has. The support structures of the lens stay the same as they've always had. And all you're doing is taking out this protein, which has gone opacified anyway, and making it clear.
Which is this?
This stuff,
blue
exactly.
bit in the middle.
Exactly,
Blue bit.
exactly. But all the rest of the lens, which is the capsule, these little support structures that hold the lens in place, all that stays the same. So in this space where the haziness is developed and where it's cleared, that's where the clear lens goes, what we call the multifocal lens.
Right.
So hence you don't then develop further hazing because the protein's gone, so it doesn't go opacified again.
Right.
And then once in place, it's sort of it's in a bit of an inert space. Nothing really tends to impact it, so you don't get people sort of who have a reaction to the lens, or you don't get that sort of impact in the eye. And lenses have been used in the eye for 100+ years.
And this lens is as minuscule as a contact lens.
It's different. It's different. It's not as thin, no, because it needs to actually have a physical structure to hold it in place. It's not firm. It's semi-solid, if you like.
Okay.
So it has flexibility because it enters the eye through a 2mm, like a keyhole access, and it actually unfolds in the eye, and that's how. And then it's centered and positioned, and all that happens over a span of minutes. So, for example, we just did just before I came to see you, a patient who had almost identical vision to you, who's had one eye done, and today was the second eye. And if you look at the actual procedure time to clear the lens was about 27 seconds, and total time in the eye was 2 minutes 42 seconds.
Wow.
So the rest of it is all just kind of cleaning and prepping.
You're not trying to beat your record on Strava or anything
No.
like that.
It's definitely not time dependent, but it's to give you an indication.
Yes. Yes.
Of course, the more hazy the lens is, the more time that goes into clearing it, because you have to deliver the energy gently and gradually. So the more hazy, the kind of longer the surgical time is.
Can I just ask you, are you worried about your eyesight going?
Well, I think it happens to everyone, doesn't it? So it's inevitable.
It's an age thing.
Yeah, it's just normal.
Yes.
It's part. And what you will notice though, say here compared to, let's say, back home, you'll notice it happens earlier. And part of that is because of the increased UV exposure.
Right.
So I definitely noticed that these changes that I see sort of, that I would have seen back in England, let's say in the 60s, I'll see them in the mid-40s and 50s. There definitely is that, because I think particularly if at a younger age you've had high UV exposure, the lens, like your skin, has memory.
Right.
That UV, once it damages a little bit of that protein, it stays damaged, and then that becomes cumulative. So hence the problem sort of happens a little bit earlier than it would if you were living in a sort of grey, rainy climate with very low UV index.
Yeah.
So that does make some...
Well, I think I've made my mind up.